So to reiterate this piece, which I think is critical, our main question and answer, sort of our movement towards, are same-sex relationships a sin? And our starting point for this whole discussion at this point is that same-sex relationships are not a sin, just like heterosexual relationships are not a sin in and of themselves. In fact, same-sex relationships are God's calling to some people to care for children, to support each other. It's the way that they can live out their call as Christians and human beings in the world that God's created. It's a part of God's plan. So that is kind of the movement of this discussion. I want to just briefly give a sense of what we talked about last week, a review of that for those who didn't hear it, and for those of us who did. It takes some time for this stuff to come into us. So we talked about Leviticus, perhaps the most used passages in terms of trying to exclude LGBTQ plus people in the church. And it starts on chapter 18, and it's verse 3, and this gives us our context for what these passages are talking about. It says, God says to them, "You shall not do as they do in Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, in which I am bringing you. You shall not follow their statutes and laws." And so God's whole intention behind these two Leviticus passages, is to set the Israelites apart. He knows they're going into a new country, into a new space, into a land where practices are very different. And in fact, some of those practices are indeed harmful as God sees it. And those practices are the Canaan practices of the fertility cult. And in this practice, you have prostitution. And in fact, sex is a part of worship. And so a person, if they wanted their crops to grow better, they wanted their wife to get pregnant, the man would go to the temple, he would pay, and he would engage in prostitution. He would gate a prostitute, often a man, in a sexual act. Other parts of these cults of fertility were child sacrifice as well. And so when God is saying to them, do not, if a man lies with a male as a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, God is instructing them not to lie with other men as temple prostitutes in worship of another god. This is the context. When it says the word abomination, which has often been generalized in a very broad sense, what we're saying here is, no, specifically abomination is talking about, again, God's talking about religious taboos, things that we should not do in worship of other gods. Sometimes in Scripture, it's a very specific thing that it's talking about, and sometimes it's a generalized thing. In this instance, what we see is a very specific type of same-sex relationship. One, even if they went to the temple prostitute that was female, would not be acceptable as well. So what I want to talk to you about today is the process that we are going through right now, as it relates to Leviticus, piece we just talked about, and Acts 10. How do those connect? What is the process that is happening right now in the church and has been happening for some time? What does it mean for the body of Christ? And here's where we want to understand what's happening, to reinterpret Scripture in light of God showing us something new in the world around us. What does it mean for the church to reinterpret Scripture? And while that may seem sort of an out there piece, it is absolutely nothing new. Old Testament prophets reinterpreted Scripture and tradition over and over again. And we know, and Jesus talks about this, that many of them were killed because they were reinterpreting Scripture. And although those ideas carried forward, they were abhorred at that time. The New Testament, and indeed Jesus himself, reinterprets the Jewish tradition and the laws, and I'll talk just briefly about that later. And today we'll see how Paul struggles with how Jesus' teachings and the Jewish law, and we're talking about this holiness code, and the tradition fit together as it relates to the Gentiles. What I want to reiterate here is that this reinterpretation is a constant opening up It's a constant opening. It is not a closing, it is an opening, and you begin to see that. So we have Acts 10, verse 9 to 35. I just need to grab my Bible. If you don't have a Bible, please grab it if you want to read along here. So it's Acts 10, verse 9. Actually, before I read Acts 10, verse 9, I'm going to read a piece from Leviticus 11. So Acts 10, verse 9 is talking about the laws in Leviticus, and very specific laws. It's talking about, is Leviticus 11, the Israelites eating certain things, and how God at one point said that they were unholy. In fact, they were separate from God. To eat these things would be to separate oneself from God. And this reading here from Leviticus is in the same section of laws that the same-sex passages are in. So Paul is looking back on a part of that and struggling with what it says and what it has told them to do. From among all the animals, these are the creatures that you may not eat. But any animal that has divided hoofs and is cleft-foot and chews the cud, such you may eat. But among those that chew the cud or have divided hoofs, you shall not eat the following: the camel, for it is unclean to you, the rock badger, the hare, the pig. Of their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean for you. And it goes on to outline all of these things that they should not eat. They've been doing this for hundreds and hundreds of years. And what we encounter in Acts, is not Paul, but Peter being revealed something different from God. Now I want you to imagine Peter in this situation. He's part of a group of people, the Jewish people, who have been engaging in a certain set of rules or certain ways of being for a long, long time. It's almost against his nature, his inner being, to go against those things. Here's what happens. And this is Acts 10, verse 9. About noon the next day, as they were journeying and approaching the city, God has sent some men to come to see Peter, some Gentiles. Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while it was prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heaven opening, and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. And reptiles are mentioned in that Leviticus piece, birds that you should not eat. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean," profane being unholy. The voice said to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. Now, while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of this vision, I can imagine, suddenly the men sent by Cornelius appeared. They were asking for Simon's house and were standing by the gate. They called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit of the Lord said to him, "Look, 3 men are searching for you. Now go up, go down, and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them." So Peter went down to the men and said, "I am the one you are looking for. What is the reason for your coming?" They answered, "Cornelius, centurion, an upright and God-fearing man, who is spoken well of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house." So Peter invited them in and gave them lodging. The next day he got up, went with them, and some of the believers from Joppa accompanied him. The following day they came to Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. On Peter's arrival, Cornelius met him, and falling to his feet worshipped him. But Peter said to him, "Get up," saying, "I am only mortal." And as he talked with him, he went in and found that many had assembled, and he said to them, and here it is, You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. Now may I ask why you sent for me? And so this goes on for a little bit, and then Peter says, I truly understand, in verse 34, that God shows no partiality, but in every nation anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. And so we see this opening up. God's opening up Peter. I'm sure he worked on that for a long time and struggled with it. The idea of circumcision in the Old Testament, given to Abraham, challenged in Galatians by Paul. Here, purity laws challenged. Eating certain types of animals. That's no longer a problem. The law was keeping them separate from the Gentiles and was in fact excluding the Gentiles from being part of the body. And God shows him that what was unholy is no longer unholy. In fact, it is good, and he is free to eat these meats, and he no longer has to condemn the Gentiles. An opening up. And Jesus himself challenges the purity laws. Constantly he was doing that. He was touching dead bodies, and these are all things that are in Leviticus. He was he had his disciples eating food from the temple. He was healing on the Sabbath. All of these things challenge the purity laws within Leviticus and are then reinterpreted in Paul, Peter, Jesus, and us today. Final piece. This is one to look up. Love is the fulfillment of the law. Against love, there is no rules. There's no law. The law only gets us so far. But love, there is simply no limit to it. It goes up and up. It goes out and down and everywhere. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about an inclusive and loving community.